Upper right-hand corner of the Pacific. Nice place. Good location. Not even a lot of biting insects or deadly snakes. So take that, Australia. It's one of the reasons we're probably on those most livable city lists. But when I say Vancouver, I actually really mean the city of Vancouver, which is about 600,000 people in just over 100 square kilometers. But we're part of a much larger region with about 2.5 million people. And that is a very nice size for an urban region. Got an advantage right there. You're big enough so that you have a mixed economy, but not so big that your problems are intractable. And we're young. That's an advantage too. Very multicultural, a place that's new. This works? Great. And we end up on all these lists. And take it for what you will. It depends what they're measuring, doesn't it? You have to know that. But what I notice here is Vancouver is in the same kind of league when it comes to healthy cities as Copenhagen. And I had a chance to go there only a year ago. I much regret I never got there earlier, but there you are. And I, in particular, wanted to go to see Nørrebro. I'd heard about it, read about it. Indeed, Nørrebro has the busiest bike route in Europe, say the Danes. Is that true? Yeah, I didn't think you'd think that. But I did want to see this. How do they measure that? And indeed, they have one of these little, what we call bike totems, tells you the number of people at any given time. And when I saw it, I thought, that number, 5,500, I'm familiar with that because we have one too at the end of our Burrard Bridge, which is one of our busiest bike routes. And here, now, this is about 7 o'clock, so a little later. And I got to tell you, of course, that measures the traffic both ways. So let's face it, Nørrebro is, as you'd expect, it's a busier route. But here's the thing. No one ever thought, when I was on city council for about 15 years, that we would ever be in the league, even close to the European experience when it came to cycling. Now, I don't think I have to make the case here that when it comes to healthy cities, active transportation is a good thing. We have some data. I'll show you that later. But let's take that for granted. If you can encourage active transportation on the whole, you're going to have a healthier city. So how do you do that? What's required to see these kind of changes occur in a new West Coast North American city for whom most people believe, just as a matter of course, that, hey, we are not Northern Europe. You're not going to see us turn into Copenhagen, even in some respects as we are. So we passed 1 million cyclists, in fact, in less than a year. Now, these are the kind of numbers that are way beyond what I think most people, as I say, had a reasonable expectation that we would achieve. So what's involved in doing that? What, in this particular case for active transportation, let's take walking and cycling, can you do to encourage a more healthy city? And there's no magic. There is some conditions, however, that you've got to achieve if you're going to see these kind of increases. Now, to get this kind of increase so suddenly, a 30% increase in a matter of a year or two, clearly something had changed. So what was it? Well, this is where you get into the story of Vancouverism, and I think it's a little oversold myself. A lot of people just refer to it as these particular architectural forms that we've developed, and because we did a lot of it at one time, very high profile, people missed this, that you've got to have a number of conditions into which the architecture is set if it's going to really be successful. And for many of you who are in the business of urbanism, none of this is a surprise. You've got to have density, sufficient density, and there's a range, and you can do it in a whole bunch of different ways. It doesn't have to be towers, but density is critical. And mix and proximity, which are different things. A mix of uses, but they have to be close together. Most North American cities, in fact, have developed a mix, but when you have to cross a 6 or 7 lane arterial just to get from one side of the street to the next, that's not proximity. Good design goes without saying, goes better with saying, and we've put a lot of work into that. If there is indeed one thing that people point to when it comes to, quote, Vancouverism, it is the quality of the landscape, and we'll show you some pretty pictures, but it's more than that. Out of it will come transportation choice. I'd argue, in fact, it's almost that if you put together those various things, it's just going to happen. People will make practical choices for their lives. You have to take that too seriously. Just the point. You can't take one of those things out and think the rest is going to work. You do have, when you're thinking urbanistically, of all the pieces that go together. And what you discover is that it's really a recreation in a contemporary way in a modern society with the technology that we have that in many ways duplicates the way that human beings have been living in cities for most of the human experience. So what works? Density. And what does that look like? Here, not surprisingly, it's concentrated around the central business district. We're basically a streetcar city. The electric streetcar really came to commercial possibility in 1887, Vancouver. The railway arrives. It's the start of a boom which has continued ever since. So we shaped ourselves around that radical technology of the time. And the pattern that you can see almost invisibly there is really the consequence of that. But the streetcar suburbs that surrounded the CBD, which basically created these kind of densities after we added another layer of Vancouverism, high-rise, fits within an area of about 8 by 5 kilometers. Let's take 10 by 10. You can fit Groningen in there, and about the same number of people. You can comfortably fit about 250,000. And you can have all of the amenities and the commercial enterprises that you need to reach that mix in proximity. Say, it is the way that human beings have built cities before. And then with the arrival of the automobile and the dominant urban designer of the 20th century, the traffic engineer, we did a very different urban form. And most of what is involved in urbanism these days to create a healthy city is urban repair. And a lot of that is by providing practical, active transportation choices in the way of infrastructure that practically works for people to make decisions about how they're going to get around in conjunction with a range of choices. So let me show you what that means. Let's take the Burrard Bridge, major access point into downtown Vancouver. Took away a lane of traffic, put in a separated bike lane, and allowed what was previously a mix, a conflict of uses, of cycling and walking, to be separated out. And boy, did it work. Now, when it comes to giving people 5 practical choices, I always do this in classes. I ask people, give me some examples. Give me 5. I want 5 examples of how people should be able to get around an urban city that works for them. So go. Shout out a few. Bike? Louder? Foot? Walking? Again? Bus? Yeah. Good news, you're exactly like every other group that I've ever done this with. And needless to say, no one ever starts with a car, which they should. Because above all, you want to avoid this futile, pointless exercise of us versus them, car versus everything else. Car is a necessary part of the mix. It's not going to go away. And indeed, it does things only a car can do, so let's acknowledge it. This is not any particular priority. It's just part of the mix. And indeed, give people access to cars without actually having to own one. We're going to be talking about that later. If you want to talk about the city of the future, it's going to be in fleet management and car sharing and all of the technologies that begin to roll out that you won't have to want to own, but have access to. Let's give it a separate category, then add transit of all kinds, biking, walking. Let people choose the one that works for them under the circumstances in which they have to make a choice. What's the weather? What are they wearing? What have they got to carry? Who are they going with? How far is the distance? Do they have to trip chain? Let them mix and match. You can solve most of your transportation problems by letting people have this choice, and certainly in our culture, people like choice. And they don't like the idea that we're going to take choices away from them or force them. In my culture, you have to get on a bicycle. So it's very appealing. And for a city like this, if you can layer these choices into a seamless web, good things happen. So start with the arterial grid. This is a late 19th century, 1920s arterial grid. We jumped over all of the complications of the medieval and the Renaissance cities. Engineers love this stuff. And it does have particular practical advantages when everything is at a right angle, even if it's kind of boring. And over that, then it makes it much easier to lay a frequent transit network. Most important words, frequent and network. In my culture, again, we get into theological arguments around technology. Light rail versus separated grade versus rapid bus. It's give all of the above. And indeed, this essential question that we're addressing at this conference, the connection between good health applies to transit as well. And when you've got numbers, and two numbers you want, one of people getting healthier, and secondly, how much money you're going to save. Having been a politician, I know that this number counts more than the former. I am also not naive to think that 115 million will be coming out of somebody's healthcare budget to build more bike lanes. That's not the way it works. But if I can convince or be convinced that these interventions justify their capital costs because over the long run, budgets for healthcare won't go up as fast, that's a pretty good argument. But you got to have the data. And then you can add in the bikeway network. Again, lovely advantage of the arterial grid. And then the latest, greenways, which is to move away from this idea that every form of transportation has to have its own separated system. And indeed, when it comes to walking and cycling, you have the particular advantage to be able to design both of them in. And I want to give you an example from my neighborhood, the Comox-Helmken Greenway, the most recently constructed. So about 2 kilometers long, it'll be 3 when it's finished. And it aligns policy-wise, another essential consideration. Does it match a policy that you are taking sincerely enough to actually have a budget item for it? Budgets are the sincerest form of rhetoric. I hear what you're saying. Tell me how much you're going to spend. And then when you do that, in this case, you get some very nice results. People like this stuff. It's literally green, literally green. And in my climate, you can grow. And then you take the grid, you take the pre-existing streets, and you do the necessary traffic calming, small interventions that make it very difficult to drive through. You can drive on, you just can't drive through. And you're getting the traffic down to the point where the other uses don't need separation in order to feel comfortable and safe. And once you've done that for all ages and abilities, for a very small investment in the scheme of things, you can change people's mental maps and you can change their activity. And you can do it by allowing them to make their own choices. So we looked at this, and in this case, wisely, a UBC design lab went in and measured what was happening before the Greenway went in and then after. This is really useful stuff, isn't it? I'd be a big fan of doing a lot more of this kind of thing. And here's what they found. So there are the numbers. You can read them for yourself. Those are actually pretty significant. Some of them have been questioned. It does depend on who you're asking, what you're asking, and what the consequences are. But here, I think, is actually some of the most valuable results. And a lot of it reads, well, duh, yeah, smooth walkways, regularly spaced benches, all of this kind of thing. But it is remarkable to see how your community begins to change just by the simple intervention of this. What it feels like when you're walking along and you just see someone who's looking at you and you nod and you say hello and maybe you start a conversation. Or this, I love this. This is not done by the 7-Eleven, this is done by the city. This bar along the, I'm not even going to try that. You can see the bar there, faces the traffic. And then the seats, and look what they're doing, and the interventions that are occurring. And the networks that are being built socially. Yeah, people love this stuff. Even if their initial response is, why is the city wasting my tax dollars to put in this needlessly expensive street furniture? And you'll get that. So here, I think, is one of the more interesting results. And again, it's a small marginal difference at this point. What you want is a longitudinal study over time, but what it's telling you is that we are addressing in a tangible way the issue that Paul Tung raised, what was it, 2 days ago, Marcel? Loneliness. Loneliness kills. So how can you provide a physical intervention into a city that encourages the kind of interaction that deals with that? And it's possible. But you have to change the speed and the relationship to the way that people normally get around. And then you start extending the system. Remember what I said about networks. Networks, well, here's another form of network. It's called a loop. Now, this is more for recreation than transportation. Your Dutch culture uses cycling more as a transportation mode, first of all, We start from the premise of recreation. And what people like are loops. Loops that they can make up at varying distance so they never have to retrace their steps. They never have to cycle back over the place they previously came from. They end up where they started. And they have a clear mental map in their heads of how that works. And these loops interact so that they can choose destinations and stops along the way. And they know they're going to end up where they started. Stuff really works, and we've spent a century. If you want to talk about Vancouverism beyond the architecture, it's this creation of this very high-quality infrastructure that works in a series of loops to create networks that gives people transportation choices. Even little ferries across the creek. It's a mix and match of the urban transportation experience. And then, again, you begin to join it up. Freeway designers know this. You bring in the traffic from every direction, you put it in a loop around your downtown core, build a hell of a lot of parking, and you've got, for most of the 20th century, what we thought would be the necessary essentials of a car-based transportation system. All you have to do is basically destroy the idea of the city to do it, because it takes so much space that the very purpose of a city, which is the congestion that's created by people doing exchange. Why are we here? Why did we build this big room so that people can come together face to face? Why did you pay me to come here across oceans so that we could crowd together to have exchange? And basically that's the function of cities. I can get a little adamant on this point, but the point I want to make here is that the key is now to begin to extend this idea of the city based upon its precedents into the one that needs the most repair, which is this city that we built around the car. Now, we've done some good things. We've created some open space, but as you can see, they're all kind of separated. You have to drive to them. Now, we are thinking strategically about regional greenways, but here you do run into the distance problem. For most cyclists, I'll take my experience, 5 kilometers. I'm comfortable with that. This city obviously works well on the 5-kilometer radius. And then you get beyond that, certainly beyond 10K, and again, people think of other practical choices. Now, having all of this green space within a distance of 5 to 10K, well, now there's real possibilities. And you can begin to see the possibility here, not just for people, but even for wildlife, of moving right into the city. And this is a literal expression of greenness, but it speaks to something that is innately human. We like the idea of the bear being nearby so long as the bear doesn't get into our garbage. Because we are so blessed by this natural setting, we play in it. And here I was asked, what's different really about our cycling culture than maybe the Danish? Do we do anything better than you? I can only think of really one thing. We're really good at climbing this stuff and cycling down it. I do want to say one thing, though, about the challenge of the landscape and competition. To me, it is something that really does set a bar that allows others to aspire to, even if they have no expectation that they're going to be in the same league. And it has an interesting filter-down effect. The Grouse Grind is literally a set of stairs 2 kilometers up to the top of Grouse Mountain, and for some reason it has become an international challenge for English as a second language students that come from particularly Asian countries. So when you're doing it, you're probably going to meet a group of Korean kids, or Taiwan, or whatever. Somewhere the culture has expressed itself so that they know when they come to my city that this is going to be one of the formative experiences that they have and take away with them. And that to me says a lot about who we are and how they think about us. The good news is that there's beer at the top and a gondola down, and the cyclists take the gondola up so they can cycle down. and we've created this remarkable North Shore mountain biking culture, which again, even if you don't do it, you can identify with it. And the champions, of course, that we see as an expression of our culture. Now, I don't want to romanticize this too much from a health point of view because it does have a downside. There's a lot of surgery involved. So that even if the health authorities recognize They have another way of encouraging people to do things that might be a little healthier and look like that. But here you now begin to see the consequences of this. It's the little kid who's being introduced to this, just as you introduce your children into cycling as well, like breathing. It's starting to happen. And the runners, you can see they're in a little pack. And then they begin to express themselves in the challenge, because the infrastructure is there to do it, the 8 kilometers around Stanley Park, the 10 around False Creek, and then ultimately that gets expressed in these great, I wouldn't call it community celebrations so much as the challenges that are taken on kind of collectively, because the city is a gym that, unlike this, can be expressed like that. All ages and abilities. And it's a way of introducing people into our culture where they come from so many different places. A challenge that they can take on that they know is going to make or feel better about themselves and their community because they participated in it jointly. Or this guy, and these guys. I see that kind of seamless, whether it's the mountain biker or the mammal, the middle-aged man in Lycra, or surely you've heard of that. Or just the commuter cyclist on the basic black bike that you have here. But, not to romanticize it, there are some tough decisions that go along with this, and these are really going to be the challenges for the city of the future that's been designed around the car, because the decision makers have to make one really important decision, that they are not any longer just going to prioritize the automobile when it comes down to it. Now they can, and most plans do, say that these days. They're going to prioritize walking, biking, and transit. Goods movement, sure. Single occupancy vehicle. But are they going to do this? In 1997, we passed this plan, and I thought the most radical statement of all was no increase in road capacity. And while it's one thing to say it, the other more critical thing is you don't give the engineers any money to do it. Safety, yes. Expansion, no. Or, if you're going to get money, it's for the transition of this to this, or this to this, and the integration of all of these modes. So again, that range of practical choices becomes an expression of movement through the city. And here are the results, data. I thought this is the most amazing one I ever came across. If you know what a screen line is, here's that line again. It's just a line where you count everything that goes across it in a day. Typically cars, but you can count anything, and we do more and more. We used to only count cars, and we put them on charts that look like this. So here, across that screen line in 1960, there you see the morning peak. Here again, you do it longitudinally, 76. Since then, we doubled the downtown population. We increased jobs by about a quarter, tourism, culture, all the rest of it. What do you think the 2010 line is going to look like if it was superimposed over that chart? Where would it end up? Well, here is where it did. Which means that the traffic coming into downtown Vancouver, all of those high-rises you saw, about the same as it is in 1965, which people don't believe. Doesn't match up with their experience. The city's still crowded and congested. Cities are supposed to be. That's their point. But what it does is it allows you to repurpose the existing space. It's just not having to build more roads. It's that you can take the roads you've already got and you can begin to intervene in ways that create certainly a greener, more livable city, but still function from the point of view of the driver and the trucker who have to deliver the goods or get to places or for whom that's the only alternative. In fact, because there is more space, you can begin to take things like parking away, and you can add the secondary separated bike routes. And even though every time we've done this in about the last 5 years, the prediction has always been that we are creating congestion purposely and the result will be Carmageddon, Carmageddon. You can trust the headlines will be there. And then we go ahead and do it. This is on a major arterial coming into the downtown core. And this one too. And guess what happened after we took whole lanes away? Nothing. And nothing doesn't get a lot of press. Disaster did not occur. You don't see that story. So it almost doesn't register with people that we keep making these interventions and changing the balance of transportation modes, at least as far as the physical expression of the city, And we go through these little battles every time. Not as much, I have to say. It's getting better. But until you got the data to show people the results, of course they're going to be skeptical if it doesn't match up with their experience. So that's where that chart came from. That's where that 30% occurred. You already had the pre-existing conditions. The density in the mix was there. It was the repurposing of the existing road space that allowed the practical and safe utilization of these other modes, the greenways and the bikeways, the networks that layered over all of the others. And so I think this is the most exciting stuff, achieved goals that for many were simply unimaginable or they were not prepared to put a time limit on, well ahead of their expectations. That 10% up there, that's all modes, work trips. What that says is, so Groningen's got 61%, all right, we're nowhere near that, but that 10%, we didn't think that was going to happen at least until about 2020, and we achieved it way before that. And we see this pattern again and again, that those ambitious goals that you set out for yourself, if they are within the realm of practicality, if they're part of a network, then they are very achievable. We can become much more like what the Europeans did 20, 30 years ago, through very much the same combination of circumstances. And so, yeah, we're one of the fastest growing because we've started from such a low base. And this achievement of these changes very quickly, of course, it creates the incentive to do even more of it, to set your targets even higher. And we did. And again, we met them way before we expected. I'll tell you, for engineers, this is really exciting stuff. If you've taken away some of their resources to build more streets, which they've been trained to do, but you give them the opportunity to be creative, and then they get these kind of results, they love this stuff when they go to conferences like this. And indeed, if you are a young engineer, that's where you want to be, because you know there's going to be more and more resources. Follow the money. That's very gratifying to see after a headline of Carmageddon, Carmageddon, that indeed we've achieved that 50%. And you see it manifested in a whole bunch of different ways. This is kind of amazing. Again, it's one of these, I don't really believe this chart. Because what it says is that if you're between the ages of 16 and 24 and you live in the city of Vancouver or the University District and you have a driver's license, you're in the minority. You're in the minority. My generation, who got a driver's license within about 15 breaths after they turned 16, find it very unusual. Now, there's a bunch of reasons for this, not enough time. But I do want to end with this. As I mentioned, the challenge of extending these lessons in cities that weren't built with the same particular advantages, the same concentration of density, mixed proximity, and a late 19th century grid that's really served us well for adaptation. These cities weren't built like that. And they like this a lot, actually. This is the Canadian dream. This is the sense of entitlement that you have to the single-family home, the back and the front yard, the elementary school nearby, which you probably have to drive to now, and the shopping center, and a freeway system that will get you across the region. And if you were brought up in that in the 1950s and 60s, or people aspire to it, it's very hard to persuade people without making them think that you're guilting them out. Really what you're trying to do, again, is offer them that same range of choices in the context of, well, a healthier city. And I do think that this message is resonating, because the data now that's coming out of the States suggests that as far as childhood obesity, that's leveled off. And I can't imagine that a parent would want to think that her child, his child, will have a shorter lifespan than they do, or that they're going to be subject to the chronic diseases. And so that message, I think, has gotten out. And so they are ready now, I think, to make the next steps. Will there be a reallocation of resources within their community to do these kind of things? Can they create the networks? The challenges are going to be harder. It is going to take time. But the data, as it flows in, as the messages that particularly people like you can send to the decision makers, I can tell you it's far more persuasive for someone with a, quote, real PhD, a real doctor, who's in the business of caring for the community, to send a message that a cycling advocate, well, they can repeat, but it isn't going to resonate as much. So here is all the evidence of the obvious. It's the sort of stuff your mother would have told you. But now you got the data. and the message and the results and the success. And so I think this is going to be the place where if you want to look at the fast-growing cities that are going to undertake some of the major changes in the way that cities like us, yes, I'm including cities like Amsterdam and the Copenhagens and, yeah, the Vancouvers, the city of Vancouvers. If you want to see where the real change is going to occur, I think it's going to be out here. And how it's going to happen, I'm not sure, but it's going to be the cities that find a way to make networks out of their already pre-existing conditions. And they're going to have to change the social status. This, I think, is maybe the first and most fundamental change. Anyone who looks at that poor guy on a bike has got one clear message. He's not a person like me. If you're in the car and you associate it with your status. So unless that bridge is made as well, unless everybody can imagine themselves of all ages and abilities, of income and status, then it's going to be very difficult to get the reallocation of resources. But it is happening, and I think a lot of it is coming through these kind of documents. That healthy built environment done by Metro Vancouver, for instance, that goes into the hands of the planners and the engineers, and ultimately to the politicians and then to the community, and it begins to give them the sense of possibility and how to do it. And got to end with the charts and the bullet points. You start with the vision. You express it in policies. You have examples drawn from the past and expressions of the future. You see it reflected in behavior, and then ultimately in the kind of data that places like this are dedicated to. For me, as a, quote, urbanist or someone who cared about this and got into politics for it, to me it's a self-expression. It's the expression of what I hope is now the obvious, that mixed-use compact places, clean, green, and safe. As our planners said, they go to the suburbs for that. We can do that in the city, and we can give them all the advantages we have of places that concentrate culture and economic activity. A variety of housing options, our biggest challenge. Many transportation choices, great successes, feet replacing wheels. Yeah, it goes without saying, it goes better with saying. They work. They work. We learned some lessons from the mistakes we made in the modern era. We've transformed how we do it, and we're getting the benefits. My city last weekend. Thank you.